I'm Brenda Berg, CEO of SparkNC, and your facilitator today. It should actually just say groupie because I took the facilitator role so I could be in here for both sessions and have an excuse. And I want to introduce Dyson Passion as our co-facilitator, and he's doing the virtual facilitation. We do have that great, this is the upside of COVID. We do have that capacity to also bring in virtual attendees, which is fantastic. This subject is so incredibly important. You saw the video with Mr. Beam this morning and hopefully read the article about Miss Art. We know this is a big part of our pipeline is that we can't provide evidence other than the praxis. And yet the conversation we're having today is bigger than just providing evidence. It's also providing tools, professional development, feedback loops for teachers that teachers crave and look forward to getting in a new and different way. So I'm going to stop talking and just introduce our speakers because I can't wait to get to the good stuff. Dr. Kane is actually here from Harvard and flew down from Boston. So thank you so much for taking your time, although you hail from
Winston-Salem. Really?
So we had a whole conversation about how special North Carolina is, and we do great things, and we are the foundation for all of this great work to happen. Frankly, I think we're going to set the tone for the rest of the country here. I absolutely believe that great things happen here, and Dr. Kane is the Walter H. Gale Professor of Education at Harvard Graduate School of Education, Faculty Director, Center for Education Policy Research. And then we also have Dr. Lynn Moody, who is the former superintendent in Rowan-Salisbury and is currently the strategic advisor for a fantastic initiative, SparkNC. I hope you get a minute to touch on that as well. And then they will take it from here. So enjoy. And if you need anything, I'll be over there listening.
Great. Thanks, Beth. Try to get through my slides so that we can hear from Lynn on just how student surveys are being used in Rowan-Salisbury schools. So first, just a little foundation setting is that the core problem we're trying to solve here is that education research has suggested for decades, for about 4 decades, we've known 2 things. Number one, that there are huge differences in student achievement ratings depending on who your teacher is. So even within the same school, classroom by classroom, there are large differences in the average gains that students make. And we know it's teachers because you'll see the same teacher having, extraordinary gains from not every single year, but a pattern over time. It's clear it's related to the teaching. So that's one fact. The second fact that we've known for decades now is that paper credentials, so whether or not you have a traditional teaching certificate, your praxis scores explain very little of the variation in teacher effectiveness that we see. And yet, we've sort of designed our systems in exactly the opposite way that those 2 facts would imply. That we base teacher certification mostly on paper credentials. And we pay very little attention to performance on the job. And in fact, in many places, teacher evaluation is a purely perfunctory exercise. Now, that would make sense. That kind of a system would make sense if the paper credentials were predictive of teachers' effectiveness, and if we didn't learn very much about a teacher's effectiveness in the first few years, on the job. But that's just not the facts. And so the hard part then boils down to just a practical problem, and that is what are some other measures of teacher effectiveness that we could use other than just test scores? Because test scores are you can only measure those in the classrooms where there's math and ELA assessments at the beginning that you can use to assess teachers' performance. I think The tests cover about 40% of K-12 teachers here in North Carolina. So that's going to be a part of a solution, but for a complete solution, we need some other things. So about 10 years ago, actually it's a little bit more than 10 years ago now, the education policy debate was facing the same question. And so we were seeing there were big differences in teacher effectiveness, and yet folks were uncomfortable with just using test scores for doing that. And it was for measuring a teacher's effectiveness in the classroom. And so I directed a project called the Measures of Effective Teaching Project, I'll describe in a second, where we worked with 3,000 teachers in 6 different school districts around the country. And the whole point of the project was to identify other measures other than just test scores that could be used for measuring teacher effectiveness, but also at the same time, verifying that those things were related to students' achievement. So it wouldn't just be based on some rubric developer's opinion about what effective teaching looked like. We wanted to see, like, okay, which of these ways of rating classroom performance, which of these ways of observing in the classroom and rating performance are demonstrably related to student achievement gains, and which aren't? And are there other things other than classroom observations that we could be using to try to measure the effects of teachers? So we looked at, there were 5 different categories of things. First, we collected video in 3,000 teachers' classrooms. And we collected the video. I'll come back to the video in a second. We did this purely for logistical reasons. We thought, well, gosh, even the Gates, and this project was funded by the Gates Foundation, even the Gates Foundation can't afford to send 5 different observers into the back of 3,000 teachers' classrooms in 6 different places around the country. We just need to collect the video, and then we can, once we have the video, we can rate it using the different approaches to classroom observations that had been proposed. And there were 5 different rubrics that we wanted to test. And this way, we could collect the video and then we trained 900 graders to rate the videos different ways, and we could see which rubrics were related to student achievement gains. We also had a test of what was called teachers' pedagogical content knowledge. So actually, this was one of the things I had to learn as a young faculty member myself, is you'd be surprised just the complicated ways in which smart people can misunderstand something. It's real, like, and the smarter you are, the more complicated your misunderstanding can be. And as a young teacher, the thing I had to learn as a young assistant professor was being able to recognize those patterns of what is it that somebody has misunderstood? What is the idea they haven't gotten that has led them to this wrong place? That's called pedagogical content knowledge, because it's one thing to know how to do algebra yourself. It's another to be able to recognize the most common ways in which people can misunderstand key algebraic concepts, and that's a testable thing. So we had some tests of teachers' pedagogical content knowledge. We also wanted to do student surveys. This is the way I get evaluated. It's ubiquitous in higher education. Everybody is evaluated with student surveys. I'm sure there was a dean someplace who first proposed that. That dean's name is lost to history.
I thought it was you.
No, it was happening long before me. But the point is, it took hold and it's become expected. And in fact, that is the only way I wish my teaching is evaluated. I wish there were some other ways my teaching were evaluated, for instance, with classroom observations, but student surveys is the way higher education does it, and it's the way we've been doing it for a while, and we wanted to see, could this be done in K-12 as well? Fourth, we looked at value added on state tests. You guys have the EBOS model here in North Carolina. We use some other models that are similar but not identical, but they're different approaches to value added. And fifth, there were questions about, okay, well, are the teachers who are good at preparing kids for the state tests, are they actually teaching conceptual understanding, or are they just teaching to the test? So we wanted to be able to answer that question. So we administered in addition to the state tests, some other tests that were primarily open-ended tests that were expensive to score, but within the context of this research study, we could score them and just see, hey, are the kids whose teachers are the kids who are doing well on these state tests also the kids who are doing well on these other tests of conceptual knowledge. So 3,000 teachers, 900 trained observers, we collected student surveys. And then the final thing is, in the second year of the project, we randomly assigned teachers to classrooms. And we asked, okay, which of these measures were predictive of the students' performance following random assignment? So like, could these measures that we collected during the first year of the project actually help us identify more effective teachers? Or were these just the classrooms where the kids were well behaved and so the teacher looked good on the classroom observation, but it's not the teacher? Well, the only way to sort that out is to, in the second year of the project, do random assignments. So that's what we did. And I'm not going to be talking about everything that studied here, but I'm going to be talking about two of what I think are the most broken, missing parts of the class of teacher evaluation systems around the country. The first one is the in-person classroom observation, which is just like in universities, student surveys are the way teaching gets evaluated. In K-12 schools, it's the in-person classroom observation that is the way most people are evaluated. And I know that value added is very controversial, but I'd argue that the most broken part is not value added, it's the existing classroom observation. And I'll talk about some of the obvious challenges with that and ways to fix it. And second, the second missing part is just lack of student voice, and I'll introduce that, and then Lynn will describe how they're using student surveys in their work. Okay, so the top 10 problems with in-person classroom observations. The first is just they're incomplete. They're limited to what the observer can write down. Think of this. It's the year 2022, and the way I'm record, if somebody in this class were doing an observation for me, the way you'd be recording what I'm saying and doing would be sitting there with a piece of paper scripting. You're going to miss almost everything that I've said if you're just, or done, if you're just trying to limit it to what you can scribble down on a notepad. A second, big challenge is it's asymmetric. So teachers who are struggling because of things they're not noticing, not because of things that they're noticing and ignoring. And it's biologically impossible for us to remember something we didn't notice in the first place. Like if your consciousness doesn't land on something, it is biologically impossible for you to remember that later. And so think about this. What's happening in a classroom observation, an observer, and you've noticed something that this novice teacher maybe hasn't noticed happening. There were 3 students in the back of the class that had their hand up and you never called them. No, there weren't. Yes, there were. It's hard to imagine improving, getting people to notice something they didn't notice in the first place. And yet that's what we tried to do with the in-person classroom observation and notes. A third thing is just opportunity cost. The observer must be available and in the school during instructional hours. A fourth challenge is just limited frequency. They're too costly to do frequently because you're having an adult sit in the back of the class watching another adult teach. Fourth or fifth, it's non-shareable. It's impossible to get multiple perspectives on the same event unless you've got people sitting like a panel in the back of the classroom. Sixth, observer content expertise. If you're doing an in-person classroom observation, you're limited to the content expertise of the supervisors in the building. If I'm an art teacher and my principal, has a chemistry background, it's going to be hard for me to put much credibility in what my my principal provides to me as feedback. Seventh, it's just high dimensionality. There are just too many factors to be tracking at the same time. Eighth is just reliability and bias. So it's difficult to verify that observers are actually using the rubrics reliably. And then ninth, people's comments, the observers' comments are often just not linked specifically to specific behaviors. And then 10th, it's distracting to have an extra adult sitting in the back of the class. The kids know it when the principal is in observing your classroom, and it's different. It's actually less disruptive to have a camera. The kids will notice the camera initially, but the camera's not moving or making faces or
I have the answer to that, and I'm sure it doesn't happen today, but I was observed 50-some years ago when I was teaching, and it was much better than I deserved. So I should have kept my mouth shut, but those who know me know that I wouldn't. I said to the principal, I said, "You've never been in my classroom. How did you do that?" He said, he had a rule you couldn't close your door to the hall. He said, "I stand outside your room and I get a better picture," which I didn't agree with totally, but
Yeah.
I understood his point.
Yeah.
So he said, "I know more what's going on in your classroom than if I came in and sat down."
But then imagine if instead of that, I could show you a video of what you did.
Yeah, that's better.
And
We didn't have videos.
Yeah, right. Well, they did. They were called movies, like moving cameras.
Was that before the talkies?
So, okay. So to test this idea, we ran something called the Best Foot Forward project. And you could guess from the name what this was we handed teachers the cameras and we said, you collect evidence of your own practice. You can tape as many classes as you want. But when you have 3 that you're proud of, you submit them to your principal. We'll provide the principal with some software that they can use to rate it. So teachers videotape their lessons as often as they like. Teachers choose the videos they like best to submit. Teachers send their videos to an observer. In our study, we use both the principal and a content expert outside the classroom. The observers watch, comment, and then provide comments in the video, like so, linked to the moment where various things happen. And then all parties could sit and watch the video and discuss it. So we were just wanting to test whether this kind of approach could improve the ways that teachers experienced classroom observations, and we did this as a randomized controlled trial. So we recruited 350 teachers who were willing to try this out. We randomly assigned some to use the video cameras, some that just continued doing observations the old way. And then we surveyed both the principals and the teachers afterwards just to see how it went. And here are some of the things we learned. So, you know, how often did you feel the conversation was adversarial? It wasn't super common that even the control group thought it was adversarial, but we saw like a 6 percentage point decline in the proportion, like the video group were less likely to report it as an adversarial conversation. And it's easy to imagine how that would happen, right? Because if you're watching the video, there's no dispute over what happened in the class. If I'm taking notes, there might be a dispute about what happened in the class, but if we're watching we may interpret it differently. But actually, that's what you want, is people trying to apply the rubric to, explain, what's happening in the class and interpret what they were trying to do. But you don't want conflict over just the facts of what happened, and video changed that. A second is like how often did you disagree with the observer score? That was less common in the treatment classrooms. How fair was the classroom observation process? They're more likely to describe it as fair. Can you identify a specific change in your practice you made as a result of the feedback from your administrator? And again, the video group was more likely to be able to point to specific things that they changed. Okay, the second thing, it just increased teachers' receptiveness to feedback. How supportive was the observer during the post-observation conference? There was, again, by solving this asymmetry power, like so in a typical classroom observation, the observer is both the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury. In the case of teacher collected video, it's the teacher who's doing the data collection, and they're showing you what they think is their best practice. And so there's no disagreement about that. So so at least the teachers perceived this to be more supportive when they were using the video. They felt like the observer was trying to make more effort to take their perspective. Okay, teachers, this was interesting. When we asked teachers to rate their own performance, remember we have a treatment group and a control group. The treatment group has the video, the control group has in-person observations the regular way, and they're randomly assigned. So these two groups shouldn't be different in any way. But then we asked them, how would you rate your own performance on a number of dimensions? And the teachers in the video group were more harsh in describing their own teaching because they saw it. They were, how would you rate your ability to assess students' level of mastery of content skills? They were actually less likely to rate themselves highly on that.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Just one question.
Yes.
So were the teachers asked to do videos of their best lessons or of like where they wanted feedback and assistance?
So they knew they were using this to substitute for their in-person classroom observations. So we didn't say explicitly choose your best, but they were I'll show you in a second. Okay. There was some evidence that they did choose their best, but you might be thinking, but wait a minute, like, aren't we losing the element of surprise? Then I'll show you in a second. It turns out the element of surprise is not worth very much in this case. So teachers were more self-critical. Teachers identified specific areas for improvement, especially around lesson pacing and time management. Things that would be easier to observe in a video. Okay, oh, here was one final, just a couple of more things about this, is we also, with the video, were able, an observer, the principal, could do these observations during non-instructional time. And so we tracked when were the observers logging in to do this rating. And 64% of the time, they were just doing the rating during non-instructional hours, either before school, after school, on weekends. It just freed up their time during the school day. They didn't need to find time during the busy school day to do their observations. They could do it other times. You know, so my wife and I never watch Saturday Night Live anymore. Right. So we time shift. We watch it, we record it, and then watch the recording. And why? Well, because you know we don't necessarily want to stay up that late. And the same thing with observers. If you give them the opportunity to do the observations during non-instructional hours, 64% of the time they did. So the video makes that feasible. Okay, the other thing that we found that was really valuable was by handing the camera to teachers and saying, you collect however many you want and then you submit 3. We got teachers to observe themselves on average 13 times rather than 3 times. So the volunteer nature of being able to choose which videos to submit meant we got a lot more self-reflection out of the video collection. Now, I was alluding to the, here, let me skip this. I was alluding to the element of surprise. So this was one question we had was, okay, wait a minute, do you lose the ability to identify the struggling teachers by handing the video cameras over to teachers? So here was our deal with teachers that were part of the study. We said, okay, you record the videos, we get to score any of the videos that you collect. We'll only show to your principal the ones that you submit, but we get to see any of your videos and we get to score any of your videos. So we could see teacher scores on the videos they submitted, so the average chosen score, and the school, and we have, you know, observers observe and score the unchosen lessons. And the thing that notice that most of the points are like this dashed line is the 45-degree line. Most of the points are above the dashed line, which is a good sign. It means teachers understand the rubric. They know what lesson is going to score higher than others. That's actually, it's a good sign. I mean, it means, yeah, people have internalized the rubric. But notice that these are very highly correlated. The teachers who did well on their chosen videos also did better on their unchosen videos. That by turning the camera over to teachers, you don't lose the ability to identify the struggling teachers, because the best lesson from the worst teacher is that much worse than the best lesson from the best teacher. The best lesson from the best teacher is really a remarkable thing to watch. And yet, so by turning over the ability to collect the video, you get more self-observation, but you also don't lose the ability to see which teachers are struggling. Okay, so just some implementation concerns before I shift to the student surveys. I would recommend at least not starting with continuing teachers, but like offering this as a pilot, as an optional thing. Because the fact is, recording yourself is a painful thing to do. I don't know how many of you, like, I'm always like stunned whenever I hear my voice on an answering machine. I think I sound like that. Like in my head, I'm not speaking as slowly as you're hearing me. But it's a hardwiring thing. Now multiplied by 10 when you are combining video and audio, and so there's an initial comfort level that you need to get over. And I think once people get over it and it becomes commonplace, it'll take hold. But at least at first, the way to do this would not be to mandate the use of these videos, but offer it as an option in lieu of in-person observations and let it grow. Let it grow on its own. An important thing that I just touched on is like these are not YouTube videos, so like there needs to be a secure platform and we created it for this project where the video the teacher collected, it was a closed loop. You couldn't get the video outside of the system to go post on YouTube. That the video would record it, the observer would see it, and they would all remain in the secure system. Yes.
Was it a vendor that you used, something like Go React, or was it a
So,
homegrown?
It was a vendor. It was a
Okay.
vendor that we used. And actually, if you want to learn more about different options, so I don't want to plug just one vendor here. There are a few different ones. There's a website that we created called Visibly Better that lists some of the existing, both hardware and software options.
So I have a question. Is the recommendation this be considered to improve like reflective practice in a district, in a school, or are you
So
suggesting, because like for like a high state, like the people in the room are like making decisions for the state,
Yeah.
is this like,
So
do you see what I'm saying? Like there's a
I
high stakes
would-
question.
So I would at this point, I would not mandate it.
Right.
I would offer it as a pilot to say, if you want to do your classroom observations this way, rather than with an in-person observer, we'll give you that option. You might then just like subsidize the cost of the camera per school or other things just to sort of get, seed the idea. You might find that education preparation programs would be a place to start. They're probably, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them have some form of this kind of system out there, now. But introducing it to the usual classroom, in-person, the classroom observation process that every teacher goes through, rather than just have it limited to educator preparation. That it would be my recommendation to make that an option rather than mandate. Student surveys are ubiquitous in higher education. This is the way that all of us in higher education get evaluated. In fact, this is the only way my instruction gets evaluated is with student surveys. We don't have the other components. I wish we did have classroom observations, or at least the kind of classroom observations I'm going to talk about in a second. But whoever the dean was that proposed student surveys, his or her name is lost to history, probably for good reason, because I'm sure it didn't make them popular, but it stuck around enough that it's become ubiquitous in higher education. Because it's new, or it's a new concept in K-12, it generates a lot of anxiety. But one thing I've learned in talking about this is if I could get people to see what some of the questions are, it takes away some of the anxiety about it. And people will say, gosh, I really would like to know what my students how they would respond to those questions. So in the next few pages, I'm going to list some of the questions that we asked, but then I'm going to shift to Lynn to talk about her experience in Rowan-Salisbury schools where they use a different survey. So just some of the questions that we asked, we used something called the tripod survey. One of them was like, if you don't understand something, my teacher explains it in another way. Do you agree, disagree with that? You know, in this class, my teacher accepts nothing less than our full effort. Here's one. My teacher wants me to explain my answers, why I have given the answer I gave. This was one of my co-authors who's just a naturally happy person. He wanted to use this question, or he was really curious about this question. My teacher makes learning enjoyable. And so the teachers in our study, we collected students' responses to this range of different questions. And then we asked, okay, which of these are most related to achievement gains? Like which of these are most predictive of achievement gains? And the three of the individual items, we didn't use an individual item, but in the final survey, we used a range of items. But if we had to pick a single question, the three single questions that were most related to a teacher's impact on math achievement were, our class stays busy and doesn't waste time. To what extent do you agree, disagree with that? Students in this class treat the teacher with respect. That's more of a classroom management kind of question. In this class, we learn a lot almost every day. That's like a pacing, rigor kind of question. Ironically, the questions that were least correlated with teacher value added on the state test were, agree, disagree, getting ready for the state test takes a lot of time in our class. I learned a lot this year about the state test. It was in those classrooms that when a large share of students said, yes, we spent a lot of time on test prep, those were not the classrooms that saw the biggest gains in math. So the classrooms that saw the biggest gains in math were in the classrooms where most of the students were agreeing our class stays busy and doesn't waste time. And in this class, every day, that kind of question. Now, one advantage of student evaluations that doesn't often get mentioned is just the power of averaging. So, even with trained observers, two people can watch the same lesson and come to different ratings on almost any rubric. It was certainly true in any rubric we looked at, and that the only way to get reliability up to where you needed it was to have two or maybe three observers. But there are lots of places where where there's only one observer doing the classroom observation. Now, it's almost for sure true that a trained observer is going to be more discerning about practice than the average 8th grader. But the advantage of the 8th grader is there are maybe 100 of them or 150 of them in a middle school. You get to average over, and that's that property of if you take the same teacher and have different groups of students rate that teacher's called reliability. Do you get about the same answer? And one of the great strengths of these student surveys is their higher reliability, just because of the power of averaging. Now, just a few, issues to keep in mind with regard to implementation with student surveys. The first is just by providing the feedback to teachers, not even including explicit points, attaching points to it in an evaluation system, in making it just common practice that everybody is getting this kind of feedback. I guarantee it has a lot more emotional impact than almost anything you can do. So even if you're not attaching a lot of official points to it, teachers will pay attention to it. I know every year, I've mentioned before, this is the main form of feedback I get. And I can tell you, I've been doing this for 31 years now. My least favorite day of the year is when I have to open up my student evaluations, not because they're all bad, but because there's always a few students who will take cheap shots. And we will all, you really want your students to learn, and you think you've done a great job, and here you've gotten feedback that, oh no, but here are these areas of growth that I have. So that moment is not an easy moment, but I think that's exactly the kind of moment that you want teachers to receive to grow from. A second issue is like just protecting student confidentiality. Like, so the way we did this was we had students fill out the form, a paper form, but we provided them with a thick paper envelope for kids to stick the form in, so that their responses were confidential as far as the teacher wouldn't know their kid's identity. But also importantly, it limited the effect of peer pressure, because think of it as sort of like a like the role that voting booth plays. If I don't know how you vote, like if there's a curtain that goes up when you go in to vote, if I don't know how you vote, it's hard for me to pressure you or buy your vote, because it's non-verifiable. Similarly, by making the student surveys confidential, you make it harder for peer pressure to sort of say, let's all gang up on Mrs. Jones. Wouldn't that be fun? By providing the envelope, you lessen that chance. So why don't I just stop talking and let Lynn describe some of her experience with using student surveys here in North Carolina in Rowan County. And it's a different survey than we use, but I'm sure there's a lot of overlap in the kinds of questions.
Good afternoon. About almost 4 years ago, the General Assembly gave Rowan-Salisbury charter-like flexibility, and that we took on a lot of responsibility when we assumed that. So we could reinvent how we wanted to hire people, personnel. We had complete personnel, charter-like flexibility in personnel, but we had a system, an accountability model that fit an old directional system. So as we tried to implement a new directional system, we needed a new accountability model to how we would account to our community of how our schools were doing. So one of the things that we looked at was student survey results. So we implemented panorama surveys, and we worked with our teachers to kind of define the areas that we wanted to look at for teacher effectiveness. But then we actually had expert researchers help us develop the right kinds of questions to do that. So because our directional system was academic measures, of course, but we also wanted to, our directional system included helping students find their passion and interpersonal skills. So the old measuring system of doing that would give us no indication whether our teachers were actually doing those things in our classroom. So we had to rewrite them. I'm going to read you a couple of questions that were on our survey that I just highlighted. How does this teacher take time to make sure you understand the material? Very similar. When do you feel like giving up, and how important and how likely is it that the teacher will encourage you to keep trying? A very interesting question. How clearly does the teacher present the information that you need to learn? How well can the teacher tell you whether or not you understand a topic? And how good is the teacher at teaching in the way that you learn best? This is one of my favorite questions. I want to read it exactly. If you come back to visit, this is on the high school survey, if you come back to visit 3 years from now, how excited would the teacher be to see you? And I will agree with what Dr. Kane was saying, absolutely. Our teachers would get very antsy about these survey results. I was describing earlier, my son taught in my district for a while, and he would say, I felt like the day that we were going to get them, I felt like I was going to throw up the whole time. But now that I work in a different system and we don't get survey results, I feel lost. I don't, as a teacher practitioner, I don't even know what to look like. I don't know. I'm not getting information from all of my kids. The only kids that give me feedback are my best students who like me already. So I think I'm a hero in my classroom. I have a really hard time. Our principals would say to you, we did it twice a year, in October and in March. It was anonymous because we were a one-to-one district and our students did it digitally. So they just submitted it digitally. It took about less than 15 minutes to do for each class. And the principals got the results back first so that they could think about what kind of conversation they wanted to have with the teacher. And they would say, every once in a while, there would be an anomaly. Every once in a while, there'd be a teacher would be like, oh, I really thought that was a great teacher, but their students are reporting something different. Or I really thought that teacher was not very effective, but boy, their students really say differently about what's actually going on inside that classroom. And so they'd have to really dive deeper or unpack further. So one of the stories, and this happened over and over similar to this, a teacher in our district was pretty loved in our community. You know, that was that teacher that everybody wanted. So they're, you know, I want to be sure my kids has that teacher at school. Her results came back and they were not as high as everyone would have thought that they would have been. And so they tried to they broke it down by subgroups, and the boys in her class have rated her a lot less effective than the girls in her classroom. Girls loved her, like she was extremely effective. Boys, not so much. And now she didn't have bad scores, but they just weren't reporting the same kind of experience inside her classroom. And when the principal had been in to observe, he just couldn't pick up on any reason for that. Like she didn't separate the boys in a certain way or anything. They went through this and they just kept drilling down to finally they discovered that all of the genre and the text that she was providing had a feminine attributes. It was all about princesses instead of football players. It was all about, you know, those are extremes, right? But so it didn't appeal to the boys in the class. So they didn't become great learners. They didn't see the work as really pulling out their best rigor because it never really spoke to them. And she would have never picked up on that. She'd been teaching for years. And she said, I would have never gotten that had I not seen these survey results. And a principal would have never observed that in my classroom, ever. So he couldn't have, or she couldn't have helped me get through that next thing. I'll also say that, because we got this question a little bit earlier about time, and I forgot to say this. We always gave our teachers a 2-week window of when to do this. So the teacher chose what day to administer the survey within a 2-week window. So if she'd just given a test the day before, or if the JV football team had lost the game the night before, and half of the class was football players, that teacher might say, oh, that was not the day that I wanted to administer my student survey because I thought things were a little wonky, or we just had a fire drill, or it could have been a number of things. They picked the day to administer the student survey. So that little bit of flexibility gave them a window into some time of having the best day to survey their class. So I think that most of our teachers, we've been doing it for 4 years. The longer you do it, the more comfortable they become with it. But typical of any kind of survey results that you give, I used to give my principals index cards, and I did this until the day I retired. And on the front of it, it would have a green dot, and on the back, it would have a red dot. And I would say, right, because I don't know your handwriting, because everything they'd send you would be an email. And green means go, go, go. This is so important to me. Keep doing this, keep doing this, keep doing this. And red means stop. You just got on my last nerve. You don't stop doing that. I'm gonna just go crazy. And then you have to fill out those signs. Like you can't leave one. And then I would put all my data on my table. And of course, I always look at the red dots first, right? Isn't that what we all do? We all look at our red dot first. Teachers will do the same thing with survey results. They really care about what their students, they care more about what their students say about them than they do about what their principal says about them. Most teachers do. And so you have to really go into it knowing that that's the typical way that people analyze their own data, is you have to give them some space and time to look at the questions where they were least effective so that they can come up with their own strategies for improvement before you start to deep dive into it. Because it is very personal data, as you can imagine.
So then I think there was a question.
A question from one of our virtual participants. They would like to know what grade levels participated in.
We did it 3rd through 12th.
3rd through
Yeah,
12th.
we did not do K2, and that was a question we got earlier, so I'm glad that you raised that. Because they can't read it themselves and answer it themselves, and we couldn't really figure out how to do it anonymously, so that we felt like that the instrument was as effective. But I think it is a question to be answered.